Well, it's the day after we had this presentation by the Isle of Man government. They made their own video explaining how we're going to get out of this eventually, or that's the potential of it anyway. I've got a few MHKs I want to talk to today. First up is Clare Barber. You watched that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I did watch the briefing. I mean, my first concern was that it was... my understanding was it had been pre-recorded, but then it came on as live, and I think there was a lot of people who tuned in thinking they were going to see the daily briefing, perhaps with a focus on the exit framework document, but in fact they had a pre-recorded armchair chat. I don't know what else you'd call it, which I think there was some positive communication from Dr. Ewart and from Mark Lewin, but I just think it wasn't the right thing. I think there needed to be public engagement around that exit framework document. I think there needs to be far wider engagement with our businesses and with our third sector, and in fact with the whole of the island essentially, and I would also say Tynwald.
Well, I think from a journalistic point of view, we keep getting surprised that these things are being put on by government rather than being a normal press conference with those people being put up. So the press in general can all have an input into the questions. Did you think it was a bit too safe then?
I did. I think, I understand that there's a nervousness from Council of Ministers, but actually they absolutely have to be able to answer questions. Essentially, this framework document is what will assist us and guide us in getting out of the situation we're in at the minute, where we seem to have this binary decision between a complete freedom or a pretty comprehensive lockdown, and there's not a huge amount that's happening in between. We're not doing the stages that we had seen in the the previous strategy document. There was a number of things that happened, and they were set against the number of cases you might see. We haven't seen that actually happen. So we had the initial Saturday where there was a suggestion that we would just have that voluntary nothing shutdown, which I think it helped. It stopped a number of huge events that potentially would have been high risk. But of course, because it wasn't a legislative provision, there wasn't an absolute that you had to shut down. There were people who continued, and some of that seems to have been done from comments that have been made with the blessing of the Chief Minister. Some things that have happened appear to have happened, because people were uncomfortable, and there was an issue around being compensated for their financial loss, which I understand. Businesses are in an incredibly fragile position at the minute, and to take away a night's key revenue from them when they're unclear as to how that will be supported by government, I understand that was a difficult decision to take. So I absolutely commend the businesses and the events that made the very difficult decision to shut down that night without huge amounts of information available to them. But I would say that what's essential in amongst all of this is far better communication with both the people affected and the wider public.
Communication. We keep coming back to that. I mean, what I took out of yesterday's watching it was I kept thinking this is all not really going anywhere because we haven't got particularly an exit strategy, because we haven't got this particular surge under control. Did you feel that as well? I mean, until we know where we're going, it's all a bit difficult putting things on paper, giving an idea where we're going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that we look at the exit framework, and I think we probably should have been doing it some time ago, in fact. And for me, there's a couple of key pages within the document. A large amount of it is just a recapping and, writing around what has happened, what might happen. Actually, we need to understand the positioning. So there's some things that I suppose are the unknown unknowns. There's things that could happen that we have no idea about. There's other things that we do know might well happen. There is a risk, which has been talked about, that the vaccine doesn't continue to protect us against new strains. And there is obviously question about which new strains may come. So there's some things that are the known, but we don't know what impact they might have. So it's absolutely right that there is some movement in terms of how a framework document works. But I do feel at the minute a lot of the talking to that document is around saying why it's not a plan. In fact, it explicitly says that in there. This isn't a plan. And I think that we need to be very robust in discussing how we're going to come out of this. with the public. There's a huge sector of people that I'm talking to who understandably are nervous. And actually, that's where we need to be very clear around that non-binary, that position in the middle where we say that there will still be a role for social distancing, there will still be a role for masks, and there will still be perhaps, an element around people having their own responsibility for their own welfare. And the vaccine will give us a huge advantage in terms of that. We're seeing that already in terms of the rollout in the vulnerable and older persons categories, those age groups in the I think we're at over 60s, we're just starting into now. But we need to continue down the track to see the wider benefit of that. And the reality is we may end up having to then look to the next vaccine rollout. I just don't know. And I say those are those unknown parts of this, but the framework, it is the right time. We should be having that discussion, but we all need to be part of that discussion. Ultimately, it affects every person, every man, woman, every person on this and children on this island, and it's absolutely essential that we speak with those people who are affected.
But information we're talking about there, I mean, Onken School came out last night on social media. I know we're all meant to be in full lockdown, but do you think this information should be still being presented? And also, we talked at one stage about getting IM areas and how many were happening in different parts of the island. I haven't seen that. Again, do you think more can be done or not? Are you happy with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think what's absolutely essential is that we do share information. I think for me, there is a possibility that those cases at Onken School are simply related to BMHK, and that's fine, but that hasn't come out in the information that's there at the minute. And I think that's a very important piece of that jigsaw. So when people don't have the full picture, people will speculate as to what the missing pieces may well look like. So we have seen a number of businesses in the last couple of days who've had to go into lockdown. They've obviously made that public because they've got pre-bookings. I assume from the wording that those people weren't in lockdown, which they didn't have to be there. They are permitted under the rules. So I think, though, that there is a need to have a better listing. I mean, I've called for publishing of venues. So, that was far more relevant, I suppose, previously, that we should have the details of which venues were affected, just simply put online so people have them available. The media can then pick up on them. The places affected are notified anyway, but it makes sure that people can access that in a timely manner. At the minute, I feel that we're getting details coming out from the venue almost a few days behind, and then people are nervous as to whether there may have been a possibility they were in the place, because that detail isn't as specific as it probably needs to be in terms of communications.
Now, each day, I understand you, as Tynwald members, get a briefing, then the public gets a briefing. What seemed to happen the other day was different numbers are being bandied about. So what's going on there? Do you think we, the public, should be getting the same information as you are getting, or what's going on?
From my understanding, we don't get details every day, but we do get briefings some days. My understanding is if you look at the numbers over the whole period, they all tally up. I'm absolutely not in the understanding that there's any messing around with figures. I think that there is clearly an issue around the numbers of people waiting for results, because that snapshot just doesn't ever appear to tally with the plethora of people who are saying, actually, there's 4 in our family waiting, and it says 1. So there's clearly a mismatch in that. However, I think in the actual numbers who are testing positive, I am absolutely confident that the numbers that we are being given are correct overall, but there is this lag, and I think we either need to make sure that every piece of information that goes out is time stamped, or alternatively we make sure that we get a proper dashboard, which I know that has now been promised, that we will get a dashboard, and apparently that will then have further breakdown of information, possibly in terms of region. I don't know, we haven't seen the information. I know that has been called for by a number of members, and would certainly be welcomed.
And what do you hope the Chief Minister will be saying to the public? I mean, he hasn't had the best press conferences recently. Do you think this is a time for a reset and to be open and honest, as we keep hearing he was going to be, and really talk to the public? And for instance, the lockdown was never going to be 3 weeks. How many times has that been asked? And we heard that from the Director of Health yesterday, that it can't be until we've got this under control. The clock will only start ticking from when it's under control, right? So what do you expect them to be saying to the public?
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that that messaging that I think we'd all anticipated came from the Director of Public Health yesterday in a pre-recorded interview rather than from the Chief Minister in a press conference where questions could be asked. I think absolutely, you know, we all understand that there's always been this statement that we needed either the 14 or 21 days from the last community transmission. So we need clear days. That's basically where we're at. It's the same as other places have done. That fits in with the strategy that has been adopted by councillor ministers. But I think we should have been transparent much earlier. Lots of people could see. In fact, I haven't come across anyone who couldn't see this had to be longer than the 3 weeks. So I think that question's been asked. I'm disappointed it wasn't answered in a more open way. You know, we can't ever say it's going to be a 3-week lockdown. 3 weeks would mean we basically had no more cases, and we were just at the very start, of course, when that was announced. I think that there is a time for apologies, and I think actually there was a delay this time round. I think we can all see on the Friday night. There was definitely commentary on social media from people who were positive and couldn't connect themselves back to any other known case. I appreciate there's a large amount of work then that has to go on with the tracking and tracing service, and those guys are working absolutely full pelt, and I really thank them for the hard work they're doing. But essentially there's a finite number of people in that team. And I'm finding that there is a lag now between the date at which the person is tested positive and then the time at which we find out that person has been in contact with a number of people or alternatively hasn't. And therefore we have we're not clear where that's come from. So that I think is a concern. There was events that Friday night that have now been highlighted as being possible transmission events or in some cases certain transmission events. And yet we did a brief shutdown on the Saturday. But then we reopened on Sunday, despite the fact we still hadn't worked out where that came from. I think an apology is always the right thing. Actually, I think it's absolutely right to say, do you know what, we're not always going to get things right. It's a difficult situation. I absolutely know the long hours that the council ministers are putting in. I don't think anyone's doubting that at all. But there are things that will go wrong, and it's absolutely right that when they do, it's acknowledged. But I've found some of the things said by the Chief Minister in those press briefings, you know, they come across as a bit surly, and I find that disappointing. It's a little bit accusational against backbench members, because I think the statement the other day was, well, it's what I've come to expect. And actually, I don't think that's helpful. I think we all want to get this right for the island. There's not one person who is in Tynwald, in my belief, that went in there to make the island a worse place. Everyone has the absolute intention of keeping the island safe and getting us through this, you know, really difficult situation. But I just think we're far better doing that working together. So I would ask the Chief Minister to really, you know, work with backbench members. I think a lot of us do feel excluded and don't feel that we have been necessarily part of the decision making in terms of this. I understand you can't have, you know, the whole island sitting around a table making decisions, but I think that we need to accept input from people, and there's some really valid input, not just from Tynwald members, but from the business community and from the public. And I think that then ties back into that call for an emergency advisory group. We've asked, it was approved by Tynwald, to have a group that sits, can make recommendations directly into the council of ministers, and has representatives from within the science sector, from within the business sector, and from other groups, you know, whether that be logistic planning, you know, emergency planning. There's lots of different things that could be drawn into that, and that just hasn't happened.
Interesting when you say about backbenchers and talking to Mr. Quayle. I'm just going to put my bit in, my tuppence worth in. I think the press feel almost the same, that we feel it is that sort of we've got to try and probe to get some information out of you, rather than it being forthcoming. Do you get that impression as well? This sort of, well, as you know, when you're in Tynwald, you are, it's almost confrontational, which isn't helpful, is it?
I mean, I did joke this year that I might get a badge saying disappointing Howard Quayle since 2016. But, you know, I find it's almost a shame, because I think, you know, I see that Howard certainly wants to, wants to get things right. I think there's an incredible pressure on him, and actually I think in the whole there's been some really, really excellent work that's happened. I think it's just been let down by when things do go wrong. There does appear to be this reticence to just acknowledge it, and it's far easier to just be a little bit aggressive and almost push back against those people who I think actually are making perfectly valid challenge. So I think that would be helpful if that attitude as it comes across, and maybe it is our perception, but I think that needs to change.
And finally, I just want to go back to that piece about the Saturday lockdown. Well, of course, it wasn't a full lockdown, was it? Because some events went ahead, and you've alluded to it, and I'm not sure if we're going to get a name out of you, but some people apparently asked somebody in government, was it okay to go ahead with a major event? And they were given a yes. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but that's certainly very confusing for people to hear that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen Facebook posts where there's events that have gone ahead, apparently, as I say, with the blessing of the Chief Minister. And it's not, none of this can be about a witch hunt. None of this can be looking for people to blame. But I think we needed certainty at that time, and it didn't come. We didn't even get what to me would have been a pragmatic decision perhaps on the Friday, which would have been to say, let's implement social distancing, masks, and limit the size of events, because the big risk is obviously a big event where lots of people are moving around. Dr. Hewitt describes this. It's not the man sitting in the corner with his pub nursing his beer for 3 hours. It's when you're up and everyone's dancing, bit of a party atmosphere, everyone's moving around, everyone's in contact with everyone else because you want to catch up with everyone. And I think some of those events that potentially did go ahead were exactly that sort of event. For me, that was why you need certainty. It's all very well asking people out of good faith to make a decision, but when that decision is something that they either can't cancel easily because there's a financial implication, everything's pretty much set up, the money's expended, or they're a business who's already purchased everything in, they stand to lose huge amounts of money. I think that's incredibly difficult. So as I say, there's a huge amount of respect from me for those businesses who lost thousands of pounds worth of products because they had perishable food that was prepared and ready to go at the point that request not to have events was made.
Finally, how's the feeling within the backbenchers of where we're going? I mean, should heads roll?
For me, it's not. I just don't think it's about heads rolling. I think we absolutely need a clear leadership focus at the minute for the island. I think we need to work together, and I think that needs to be about a two-way communication stream. And at the minute, if I'm honest, I feel it's pretty much one way.